I think I will start with a little anecdote. I'm a playwright, and in the year 2005, I did a play with a theatre company, Theatre Matra. Okay, I hope not to get too long-winded about this, huh? But I was doing research basically because one day someone handed me a booklet, and the title of that booklet was Why the ISA? Yeah. So there was this English version, but someone handed me the multilingual version. So it had the Malay title of it was called Mengapa ISA? Mengapa is why. And I was very intrigued by this booklet because obviously it was printed to legitimize the ISA in the wake of the JI arrests. Yeah. And what was interesting for me, I looked at it and it had a potential for mischief because ISA in Malay spells Isa, which is the Quranic name for Jesus. So I was looking at it and it says why Mengapa Isa, which is also why Jesus, and made it look like an evangelical pamphlet, which I suppose is propaganda, evangelism, close cousins. So anyway, I was browsing through it, and what struck me was that there was no mention at all of 1987's Operation Spectrum. So in an attempt to legitimize and justify this draconian law, it seems as if there was this very striking omission. It seemed as if there was something that still needed to be hidden. And of course, it gave rise to a lot of questions. I mean, what are they hiding if really there was all this anxiety to justify it during that time? And an entire parliament almost chorusing in unison in support of what happened in 1987. Why then, sort of gloss over that very important piece of history? And it's an informative book because it talks about stuff like some terrorist activity, some Laju ferry, whatever, a lot of cloak and daggers, espionage kind of stuff. But there was zero mention of both 1987 as well as how the ISA was used in 1963. And of course that's a mystery to me. If you had conducted this particular Operation Spectrum that year, why are you not sort of proud of it? Why are you not wearing it as a certain badge of honor? It is part of the history of the ISD. And it made me think about, and I'm gonna make, I suppose, quite a general statement here. And I've always believed that all politicians lie. It isn't in the nature of being a politician. I'm not saying that all politicians are liars, but they do lie. Because it is in the nature of politics, it is the nature of power. Some lies are whiter than others, but for most part they lie. And how do they lie? By narrowing alternatives into ultimatums, for example. We either go this way or that way, and by not actually looking at other kinds of alternatives, by omissions, as I have observed in that Why the ISA booklet, by also taking undue credit. For example, we were the ones who came up with these particular ideas, sort of a civil society had no part. For example, in coming up with some of these initiatives, everything is so centralized and everything came from the top because we have the best gene pool. So I have to qualify that. I'm not saying it's all politicians are liars. I seem to be covering my backside a lot, but I'm saying that there are all these instances of lying, which is part and parcel of being a politician, because the edifice of power, however monumental it looks, is also very fragile because every day you have to paper over it with these little lies. And I think what's very interesting for me is living in Singapore, this idea of Operation Spectrum or the Marxist conspiracy has been one huge lie. And I say that because of the absence of any credible evidence that can be used to convince the population that this was something that was completely essential to maintain the security of this country. So what does Operation Spectrum mean to me, and I think specifically members of my generation? I think it represents this kind of a little black hole in our history. We don't have all the answers as to why it happened, and also a kind of open wound for me as well, because there has not been any admission of error on the part of the authorities. That, you know, once in a while you hear statements like, oh, actually the people who were arrested, they weren't really troublemakers, they were idealists or they were do-gooders. But it begs the question then, why were do-gooders being punished? What kind of a society do you live in if you punish people whose only aim was to do good? Yeah, and I think it all boils down to this question of moral legitimacy, and I think that is the question I'm always struggling with. What does it mean to be a ruler? What does it mean to be a leader of a people? We look at the legitimacy of the government in Singapore based on what they can deliver in economic terms. So if they can give us a certain continued GDP growth or economic prosperity, etc., then they are apparently a good government. But I don't think this is just the standard that we should hold them up to. I think as a leader, what you should also be able to demonstrate is a certain kind of, I will come back to this phrase over and over again, moral legitimacy. I don't necessarily expect the state to be the conscience of a country, but it has to act in ways which are ethical. And I think 1987 for me represented a certain kind of betrayal of those kinds of expectations. So when I talk about moral legitimacy, it becomes a little clearer to me why a lot of the people who were persecuted were actually people who were engaged in, for example, social work, engaged in ideas of social transformation, even if this was, let's say, through the realm of ideas. Let's say if you're an artist, people have said, oh, the artists are actually the conscience of a society because they raise the difficult questions, and they ask all these hard questions about, okay, which direction are we going, etc. So there seemed to be that sense for me of how the state saw this as a kind of threat to their own legitimacy, because they could not claim a certain moral legitimacy for themselves, and therefore they could not allow other sectors of the population to act as this particular conscience of society. And it's always very disillusioning for me to see how this idea of moral legitimacy has been sort of corrupted over time, how it has been streamlined and defined and circumscribed in a very narrow manner. And by that I mean, okay, we have moral legitimacy because we are not corrupt, for example, because we do not take bribes. But I think there are definitely other, much larger dimensions of those things that involve issues like what are the rights of citizens, what kinds of freedoms do we have, what is the meaning of social justice, for example, which are all, moral and ethical issues as well. So, reading Solang's book, I found it to be a very harrowing experience. Yes, because I see that book as a kind of counter-testimony to the kinds of things that were printed and published during that time in '87. I don't know whether, some of you have done your research, but if you look at the Hansard transcripts, which are basically parliamentary transcripts in '87, it was so frightening to see how so many of the MPs were basically echoing one another. And I think for me, it made me all the more convinced that we need some kind of political pluralism. I mean, it's not just about checks or balances or whatever, but basically the more people you have who are potentially on, say, opposing sides, the closer I think you get to a sense of the truth. When you have an almost a near monopoly of parliament, I think it's much easier to lie, and as I've said, politicians lie all the time. So I see Solang's book as this lone voice, but I hope there'll be more in the future that acts as a counter to the kinds of propaganda that was actually manufactured during that time and are still being manufactured today. With phrases like these people are dangerous because they are part of a united communist front, for example. I mean, what does that mean? And so much of it is rhetorical, and there's so much that we really need to start unpacking, yeah, and not take these things for granted. And I think that's also the other issue about one of the effects of this so-called Marxist conspiracy. I'll just list down a few. I think it had very far-reaching consequences on civil society, for example. The nightmare scenario of actually having people visit you at night, knocking on your door, barging in and arresting you was materialized. Yeah. So it definitely had a chilling effect. Okay, you want to do good, but please, do it through the proper channels. So civil society was one casualty, I feel. It had effects on the social dimensions of religious activity. Yeah, and I won't go too much into it, but it's always made me a little sad that when I used to think of people who were involved with religious organizations as involved in altruistic ideals like welfare for the poor, etc. And these days it's just sort of that connection between capital and religion is becoming quite scary. It seems as if it's more about self-enrichment than anything else. And obviously, I come from an artistic background, so this particular incident did have a very, very chilling effect on artistic expression in Singapore. I mean, that idea, that myth, was being played out. Our worst fears, the knock on the door, middle of the night, no recourse to the law, because in a sense, the Internal Security Act transcends the law. Yeah. So. These are all the effects, but I think on a more general note, it was also about this kind of epicenter where I think the aftershocks is this sense of fear that gripped everyone. And when I say fear, there are many, many, many dimensions to it. One, which is basically the fear of taking initiative. One, a permission-seeking behavior. I mean, a lot of us don't start acting, on our consciences, unless we have some kind of permission from somewhere. So there are many mechanisms in place, like for example, Registration Societies Act, etc. So it's so difficult, I think, for members of civil society to translate their knowledge into action, precisely because of this permission-seeking behavior, and an automatic trust in authority, I think, is also one of the ill effects of this, that we trust so much people who are in power. We believe that they know what is actually best for us. Yeah, and I think in other societies, if let's say someone says, oh, we need that so-called that law, that move on order. Because we trust that our policemen will not abuse their powers, but I don't believe this at all for a moment. I think we should always be skeptical of those who have more power than us. I think it's a very, very natural instinct. A small dog will look at a big dog and, okay, I don't think I trust you because you are bigger than me. You can harm me. You have that power to commit some kind of violence against me. And lastly, it's this instant assumption of guilt, I think, which is a product of living in this regime, in a certain climate of fear. So when someone in uniform approaches you, almost immediately you're like, okay, what did I do wrong, right? That becomes almost reflexive, instead of what does this guy want, or what is going on. One of the first things is an almost automatic self-recrimination. Oh, what did I do wrong, and how can I start to prove my innocence? So for me, looking at 1987, I don't think as a society we can actually move forward unless we we come to terms with what's happened. Yeah, of course, ideally there should be some kind of a truth and reconciliation committee that's being set up to actually examine what actually happened, where were the directives taken from, why were people behaving in a certain manner. And I have to say personally, I feel very invested in this particular moment in our history, because I think about Whitley Detention Center, and I think about, in a sense, the two kinds of people who were there, the detainees as well as the officers. The detainees who were subjected to various forms of not just incarceration but even violence, and of course the officers who committed these acts of violence. And you know, the thing about let's say the histories of certain countries like Nazi Germany or Japan is that they have had this sort of stained past, but you know, a way to heal is to come to terms with that past. So for example, in Germany, you are being taught about, let's say, the Holocaust as early as, let's say, primary school. So you know this, and you're aware and you're conscientized, and you ask yourself, do I have that capacity for evil in me? You know, and can I always remind myself never again? Japan is a little bit more complicated, because there is this kind of distancing that, that was a product of a particular era, of a particular kind of propaganda machine that was operating, the cult of the emperor, etc. And those people are different from us. When I think of what happened in Whitley Detention Center in '87, I feel that I am both the detainee as well as the officer. As a human being, I think all of us, we carry that capacity for violence in us. We carry that capacity for, you know, that there is a certain darkness that I think all of us are capable of. But on the other hand, on the part of the detainees, I think we are also capable of remarkable courage. We are capable of doing things like, one of the things that really affected me reading Solang's book is how she would mention at times she would try to empathize with her case officers. She would try to see them as these human beings with jobs and families, and she did even try to think about cooperating just so that they would not risk their jobs, you know? And she did try to rationalize it as a kind of Stockholm syndrome, this kind of sympathy for your kidnappers. And I think it was very clear to me that it was an asymmetrical relationship, of course, that you have these detainees who exhibited much greater humanity than their captors, who obviously saw them as, I don't know, you know, either scapegoats or these vessels through which you are supposed to break and extract confessions from. So that for me was a very harrowing moment in the book, when you obviously have this asymmetrical relationship, one party trying to humanize the other, and the other party completely trying to dehumanize the other. Because, I mean, how can you beat someone up unless you see the person as less than human, unless you see the person as not consisting of your own anatomy, yeah, of the very nerves that can cause you pain. So when I look at this, I realize that this is a society that has this kind of duality. We are both the captors as well as the detainee, insisting that the truth would have to come to light. There needs to be some kind of commission of inquiry into what happened, because otherwise this present government will not have any kind of moral legitimacy. And lastly, I will just talk about the title of this book. I think it's a beautiful title because, you know, it's called Beyond the Blue Gate. And as much as it's the idea of the beyond, you can see it from the perspective of someone who was within Whitley Detention Center and yearning for the freedoms outside. But I think from the perspective of some of us who have enjoyed free lives, it is also about being on the outside and looking in. So that there is that dual perspective, yeah? And we, as people who have not been through this incident and has not suffered, what then is our responsibility? How can we try to imagine what happened inside and tell ourselves that this should never happen again? How can we build our networks of solidarity and empathy for one another to ensure that this must never happen again? And I think the one of the ways to really guarantee, no matter how much they try to soft sell the Internal Security Act as a kind of new anti-terror legislation, a very useful tool, etc., the ISA really has to go if we wish to see ourselves closer to these people, to these courageous detainees. And if we believe in the idea of certain conscience in society, it's suddenly gone all disco for some reason. But yeah, so I don't see any other choice actually than to call for the abolishment of the Internal Security Act. And thank you. Thank you. Wow. And I think with that, I would like to hand over to Ms. Teo Solang, who will share with you, her experiences of writing the book. Thank you very much.